So in the last section, we went over basically what is meant with the CE marking and what the CE marking symbolizes, and we saw that the CE marking is nothing more than a list of characteristics. So now let's try to see what is required for manufacturer to draw the CE marking, what is required of you to CE mark your products, because we have already talked about this harmonized standards and standards requirements and so on. So let's take a closer look at what is meant by those. And the first thing here, I would like to just say that the CE marking is just a manufacturer's guarantee that their product characteristics are what they say in the CE marking. And so you don't have to apply for a CE mark. You don't apply from any government agency or non-profit. You just affix the CE marking to your product when you think that your product, once you determine and think that your product's characteristics have been determined in the appropriate way. And the important thing is that they have proof of this. So they have proof that their product's characteristics are what they say they are. So if we are saying that our product's wind class is 3, then we actually have proof of this, that we can say to a third party, or we can say to a government inspector or whoever, that we can prove that our product's wind class is actually 3. But in essence, a CE marking project is divided into 2 parts. So first we have the thing about determining the product's essential characteristics, and these characteristics are those that are presented in the CE marking as a list. So we have the CE mark, and then we have the list of characteristics that are given out in the CE marking. So one part of the CE marking project is to determine the characteristics, and this means first we must choose which characteristics to determine, and then we must decide on how to determine them. And for both, we are going to see later, there are strict step-by-step instructions on how to do it. So, and the second part of the CE marking project is to set up a factory production control system. This is kind of like quality management system, but not really, because it has nothing to do with quality, or at least improving quality. But the thing to remember at this point is that the CE marking project is divided into 2 parts. First, the determination of product's essential characteristics, and then the setup of factory production control system. And this is usually abbreviated like FPC. That comes from factory production control. And why we have these 2 things in the CE mark in the first place is that the thing is that CE marking is valid for as long as you can guarantee that the characteristics are still the same. So if we would CE mark our door today, the CE marking would be valid from here till the end of the times, as long as we can guarantee that the characteristics of that door haven't changed. From this we can see how it actually, the factory production control and the product's characteristics relate to each other. So first we would just determine the characteristic before we CE mark our product in a type testing. So in this case, we would just, if we were manufacturing a shutter, we would just determine that by test that our product's wind resistance is technical class 3. And then we would just set up the factory production control system and CE mark our product. So this is the point of time when we CE mark our product. So now we would have CE marked shutter. And then we would have the factory production control system in place. And with this factory production control system, or very loosely a quality management system, through it we would assure that the wind resistance of our shutter would remain the same. So in the beginning we would just determine the essential characteristic called wind resistance. And with the factory production control system, through tests and controls and so on, we would make sure that the wind resistance stays the same. And this is the point of the whole CE marking project, divided into two parts, into the testing and to the factory production control. So we would just perform this testing once, and then we would assure ourselves that the characteristics remain the same with the factory production control system over time. And naturally, if we introduce new products, we would go over this process again. With the first, we would test the new product, and then we would assure that the characteristics stay the same with the factory production control system. But in a sense, we don't have to retest our products again to determine the values, because we can guarantee them with the factory production control system. But again, you as a manufacturer don't have to come up with what needs to be done. You don't have to decide for yourself what kind of characteristics to determine, and you don't have to determine yourself how the FPC needs to be set up. You don't have to decide what CE marking includes and what needs to be done. But all of these are given out in detail in the standard, and in specifically the harmonized standard. And if we think about what needs to be done, we can look at the standard as it has detailed instruction on what needs to be done, and especially who can perform what. And in this point, I'm just already going to say you that in some instances, manufacturer can perform everything, meaning determining the characteristics and also setting up the FPC system. But in some cases, the manufacturer must employ the services of a third party to either determine the characteristics or in the certification of FPC system, meaning that the third party must verify that you have set up the FPC system appropriately. But now let's just take a look at what needs to be done and who can perform these tasks. And all instructions depend on the product's AVCP system, or is called Assessment and Verification of Constancy of Performance System. So this means basically, in layman's terms, the division of labor in terms of CE marking. And the rule of thumb here is that the more critical the product, the more likely it is that you must employ a third party, meaning a product certification body or a test laboratory. And the tasks assigned to the third party increase when the class decreases from class or system 4 to system +1. And if we take a really overall view of this whole system, we can see that here we have listed all the different AVCP systems that are available to the CE marking of construction product. So the available possibilities are +1, 1, +2, 3, and 4. And here we can also see that the tasks that must be performed are setting up and documenting the FPC. And in relation to this, we have the FPC certification, where the third party basically verifies that we have set up the FPC properly. And then we have, in some cases, that we have to perform some supplementary product testing as part of the FPC. So here we have the things that relate to the factory production control. So the second step in the CE marking process. And then we have these two, product testing and random product checks, that relate to the determining of the product characteristics before we CE mark the product. So we have two kinds of tasks here. So we have the setting up the FPC and certifying the FPC, and also the product testing. And here, in the best case scenario in terms of product cost and also the project duration, we have the system 4, where manufacturer himself or herself can set up and document the FPC system and also perform the product testing or determining the product's characteristics based on the standard instructions. And as you remember, once we start to move from 4 to System 1 Plus, the division of labor and the tasks assigned to the manufacturer decrease, and at the same time the tasks and responsibilities assigned to the certification body or test laboratory increase. So in the System 4 we had the situation where the manufacturer could perform everything, and in the System 1 Plus we have the situation where the manufacturer only has the possibility to set up and document the FPC and then do supplementary product testing as part of the FPC. So this is only the quality assurance. And then we have to employ a certification body to do the product testing, but also perform random product checks. And then we have to also ask them to certify our FPC system. So we have a certification body in 3 tasks, and this can be quite expensive, and this can also take quite a long time to get them involved in the process. But in this last slide we were talking about this class depends on how critical the product is, or how big the risk of the usage of the product is to the customer and so on. But you don't have to decide this for yourself, but this is actually given out in the standard in very specific terms. So and especially it's given in the Appendix ZA of the harmonized standard. So here we have a harmonized standards Appendix ZA, and here we have the table actually ZA2 that deals with the attestation of conformity system. So this is the AVCP systems, and here we have the product that this deals with. It's called steel tanks, and here we have the different options. Now let's put it like this. And in this case you can see that the steel tank, that is one product, has 3 options regarding the attestation on conformity systems, and also by extension it has 3 possible ways of dividing tasks between you and a third party. And in this case you would be able to perform everything yourself. In this case you would have to give some task to a laboratory, and in this case you would have to involve a certification body to certify your FPC system and also perform some product testing. But the system that you must follow depends on the intended use of the product, so in this case steel tank. And you can see a description of the intended use here for each and every case. And then you would have to decide for yourself which of these intended uses is suited for our steel tank. So if it's just for installation for the transport, disposal, storage of water, not intended for human consumption, it would mean that attestation and conformity system is 4, when you can by yourself perform the product testing and also by yourself verify that you have the FPC system. And then if the intended use of the steel tank is transportation, distribution, storage of fuel intended for the supply of building, heating and cooling systems. So if we are actually storing something else besides water there, then it would be system of 3, and it would mean that you would have to employ the services of laboratory to determine some of the characteristics of the steel tank. So you cannot determine all the characteristics by yourself. And in the system 1 you would have to, where there are fire regulations in place. And in this case, if we decide that okay, our steel tanks intended use is just the storage of water that is not intended for the human consumption, we would use the system 4 to CE mark our product. And then in the same appendix, and actually in the same next table, we would have the tasks divided based on the decision we made in the previous table. And in this case, we would only have tasks for the manufacturer. So we would have the task of setting up the factory production control system and the task of performing initial type testing. This initial type testing is basically just first you decide what characteristics to declare and then determining them. And if we had made some other decisions and we were talking about other products, and here we have a example of the same table as before, we would have the division of labor differently. So here we are talking about the structural steel and aluminum components. Then here the system would be 2+. So we would have some tasks that are the responsibility of the manufacturer, and then we would have some tasks that are given out to the certification body, and in this case this. So here we can see that the manufacturer is in charge of initial type testing or determining the product's essential characteristics. The manufacturer is responsible for setting up and documenting factory production control, and the manufacturer is also responsible for the sampling, testing and inspection at the factory, so testing of the products being manufactured. As for the certification body, they would be responsible for the initial inspection of factory production control and also the continuous surveillance, assessment and approval of FPC. So basically this would mean that you would set up the FPC system and then you would ask a certification body to give you a certificate for the FPC system. So basically this certification body would just say that or determine if you have set up the FPC correctly or not. But naturally this begs the question of what kind of characteristics you must determine and how you must determine them. And the thing is that all possible characteristics are listed in the harmonized standard, and we're going to take a look at what those listings look like. But the thing to remember here is that standard only gives you the maximum number of characteristics that can be declared as part of your CE mark. And here the key is maximum number of characteristics. So the standards appendix ZA only gives you the option that which characteristics you can declare. And then we have the other part, the construction product regulation, that mandates you to declare at least one characteristic. So it is up to you to determine how many and which of the characteristics you want to declare, as long as it's at least one, and as long as all the characteristics that you declare are given out in the appendix CA. And if we take an example here, and here we can see again in the appendix CA that all the characteristics or essential characteristics that can be declared as part of the CE mark. And they are always defined in this kind of way, that there is a list of characteristics that can be given out in the CE marking, and all these would be just listed under the CE marking. So we would have the CE and then some information about the company, and then we would have all these characteristics that you decide to declare in a list form, and then that would be your CE marking. But like I said in the previous slide, these are the potential characteristics that you can declare in your CE marking, not those that you must declare in your CE marking. So you can decide to declare all these characteristics: reaction to fire, mechanical resistance and stability in terms of wall thickness and welding, internal pressure, permeability, release of dangerous substances, and durability against corrosion. So you can decide to declare all of these characteristics, or you can just decide to declare one of them, or you can decide to declare 2, 3, 4, or 5 of them. But the thing is to just remember that you can decide how many characteristics you are going to declare and which of the characteristics you are going to leave out. But if you decide to, for example, declare the characteristics related to mechanical resistance and stability called wall thickness and welding, we would again see the instructions on how to determine them and what they actually mean here. And here, this column right here gives you the place where you must look for on how to declare the characteristics of wall thickness. In this case, it would be the section 4.3.6.1 of this harmonized standard, where we have this appendix CA. And then for the welding, how to determine the welding, we would have the 4.11.4. And in this case, if we were to declare only the essential characteristics of wall thickness and welding, we would have the CE marking. And then we would have wall thickness. I'm just gonna put VT here. And then we would determine it with the instruction given out here. And then we would get the class, let's say it's like class A. And then we would have the welding, and we would just call it welding, and we would just determine is it pass or fail, and here we would just put P. So this would be the CE marking that we would attach to this steel tank actually. And naturally, if we want to also declare the internal pressure, we would just go to this part of the standard section 5 and determine, see the instructions on how to determine the internal pressure, and then we will just declare it as part of the CE marking. But the thing to remember is that CE marking is just a list of essential characteristics, and you can decide which characteristics you declare from the list given out in the table in the standards appendix CA. So this is basically about the essential characteristics. Later we are going to take a closer look on how you can actually determine the characteristics, but here I just want to say that the characteristics are always listed in the standard, and also the way to determine them is also listed in the standard. And if you can remember, there's also the second step in each CE marking project, and it's setting up the factory production control system. And in this first lecture, we are not going to go too deeply into it, but the point of the factory production control system was to verify that the results that we received in the initial type testing are still valid in the future. And factory production control systems, how to set it up, is also given out in the standard in the section 6.3 in this case. But the thing I would just like to mention here is that this system has nothing to do with quality management system like ISO 9001 or something like that. But the factory production control system on how to set it up and what's the scope of the system is given out in the same standard. And to summarize, the CE marking of product requires you to documentally determine the product's characteristics, essential characteristics. First, you must decide on which characteristics you want to determine, and then to determine them in the way that was specified in the standard. And then the CE marking also requires you to develop an FPC system that is used to verify that these characteristics are still valid. And who must do what depends on the standard. So do you need to get this FPC certification or not? Do you need to get a third party involved with the determining product's characteristics or not? It all depends on which system you got, and you can see that in the standard. And as a side note, I would just like to point out a few things about these CE markings, and especially the content of the CE markings and which characteristics you are going to declare as part of the CE mark. The first thing that we haven't really gone over yet is that if a characteristic is deemed as an essential, so it has been listed in the appendix ZA as being essential, it can only be declared as part of the CE marking, and that's it. So, for example, if the weldability is deemed to be an essential characteristics, and there is one way to determine it, that it has been specified in the standard. You as a manufacturer, if you want to declare weldability, it must be done with the standards instruction and as a part of the CE mark, and that's it. And nowadays you cannot, for example, declare your product to be weldable or have a good fracture toughness or whatever in any other way besides the CE marking. So you cannot declare that your product is weldable or it has fracture toughness or something, or it has a material class of something in brochures or any other marketing material if it's not declared also as part of the CE marking. So that's the first thing. And the other thing I would like to just mention here is that even though the legislation lets you to just declare one characteristics, it might be sufficient now, because what we have noticed is that the customers and regulators don't really understand what the CE marking is. So what they are usually just requiring you to have is to have a CE marked product, and they are not really concerned about the characteristics that you are declaring or for the content of the CE marking. So at the moment, if you just want to get the CE marking right quickly and your customers don't know what they're asking for, you can just declare one characteristic and be over with it. But in our opinion, in the future, this will change, and as the CE markings become more common, the focus will shift from having a CE mark to the content of the CE mark. So in the future, it is likely that you should have more characteristics declared as part of the CE marking than just one, to make it easier for the customers to compare different products.